similar situation. The blood supply and the innervation going to these organs comes from the back wall. So you have these structures that are surrounded by visceral peritoneum, but they have to get their blood supply into them and their nerves into them, and they come through these double layers of peritoneum that are connecting the back wall to the organ, known as mesenteries. So they don't just sort of zoom across the abdominal cavity, they slide in from the back. So these organs are intraperitoneal. So the organ sitting here surrounded by visceral peritoneum, connected to the back wall by a mesentery, and floating in this intraperitoneal cavity here. Some organs started out that way in development, but they get pushed over to one side, and the visceral peritoneum sort of disappears, and the parietal peritoneum encompasses them. So they're lying against the back wall. They don't have mesenteries dangling them from the back wall. They're called secondarily retroperitoneal. And then, as I said, the aorta and the inferior vena cava are behind. They're outside of this peritoneal cavity from the very beginning, so that's called primarily retroperitoneal. It's true of the aorta, it's true of the inferior vena cava, it's true of the stuff in the pelvis, which we didn't dissect, but it's also true of the kidneys and suprarenal glands, which are behind this peritoneal sac that contains much of the digestive system. As I said before, sympathetic innervation to these abdominal organs comes from these splanchnic nerves. Okay, they come down from the C5 all the way down to the upper lumbars, and the preganglionics travel through. They don't synapse along these paravertebral ganglia. They go to ganglia in front of the celiac artery or the superior mesenteric artery, the inferior mesenteric artery, and then the postganglionics go to whatever organ they happen to be going to. Sympathetic is flight or fight. So if you're trying to outrun a cheetah, you don't want to have all your blood in your stomach digesting your lunch. You want it to go to your muscles. So sympathetic innervation slows down peristalsis and digestion to send all the blood to where it's more useful in getting away. Parasympathetic is designed to, or in general, helps you acquire energy. So it promotes peristalsis, it pushes the food through your digestive system and helps you absorb the food. Parasympathetics to the abdominal organs, well, to thoracic organs and abdominal organs, all come from the vagus, which we spent a lot of time seeing in the head and neck. We saw it travel through the thorax, travels into the abdomen where it's not very obvious, not like it is in the thorax. And it goes to all of the abdominal organs in the peritoneal cavity up to this left colic flexure. The parasympathetic parasympathetics to the descending colon, sigmoid colon, rectum, as well as the pelvic organs come from S234. Visceral pain, as we said, is not very, very specific. It tends to be sort of a dull pain. And it also and so that it with the visceral pains following the sympathetics back. So where the sympathetics of the abdominal organs are going to end up, they're going to end up, somewhere in T1 through L2, and many of them are going to end up in, T5 or T6 or T4. So that if you have visceral pain in these abdominal organs, the fibers are going to go back with the sympathetics to the thoracic region, not be down here in the lumbar region. So you can feel pain in abdominal organs according to where the sympathetics end up, where the sympathetics come off of the paravertebral ganglia. So the gallbladder, you might feel up here in the back of your shoulder here, not because the gallbladder's there, but that's the fibers, the visceral pain gets confused with somatic pain because they end up in the same parts of the spinal cord. And likewise, various abdominal organs can have But in some cases, the abdominal organs are lying right next to the parietal peritoneum, and that does have somatic sensory fibers. So, for example, your appendix, if you've got an inflamed appendix that's lying right up here against the anterior lateral abdominal wall, what you're actually feeling is somatic sensory pain on the abdomen, on the parietal peritoneum. It's not actually being referred, it's just it's right next door. So you get a wide range of places where you can feel referred pain from these abdominal organs for a variety of different reasons. Posterior abdominal wall, like we said, this is stuff that's primarily retroperitoneal, the abdominal aorta, giving off arteries at each level. There's intercostal arteries up here in the thorax because they're under between ribs, but there's still little arteries coming out in the posterior abdominal wall at essentially virtually every spinal level. We don't talk about them much, but they are there. And likewise, the inferior vena cava is picking up veins coming from the posterior lateral abdominal walls. Back here we have kidneys and suprarenal glands lying above them, which are all on the posterior surface, and we dissected those, looked at the parts of the kidneys. And then, for the past numerous weeks, all of October and most of November, we've been doing skulls. So obviously you learned all the bones of the skull from both the outside and the inside, and what articulates with this and what these different sutures of the cranium are called. In addition, there's all sorts of things, here's the different sutures, then there are little bumps here called the fibioles granularis. Okay. And then there's a groove here for sinuses. I better hurry. The internal of the cranial fossa is divided into three main fossa: an anterior cranial fossa, a middle cranial fossa, and a posterior cranial fossa. There's lots and lots of foramina, which you need to be able to identify. And real quickly, too. And at this point, you also need to know what goes through these foramina. And you've also learned to identify these not just on the skull, but with the dura intact. So you can see roots of the cranial nerves going out through their various foramina to be able to identify the roots of the cranial nerve and cranial cavity. There are these dural venous sinuses, which we saw when we removed the brain. Right, there's your superior sagittal sinus, your inferior sagittal sinus, straight sinus, all of which are in confluence. And then you have these transverse and sigmoid sinuses, plus a superior petrosal sinus and inferior petrosal sinus. This big cavernous sinus on either side of the sella turcica, which has various structures going through it. So these are all fairly familiar, should be fairly familiar to you. And we pulled out the brains and looked at the rough lobes of the brain and the blood supply to the brain, coming from two main sources: the internal carotid and the vertebral arteries from the back, and then there's this circle of Willis, which enables collateral circulation. If something's busted here, the blood can still get around. We opened up the orbit, identified a whole bunch of muscles, a whole bunch of nerves, and various blood vessels, which you need to know. Lots and lots of cranial nerves going in here, which you should be able to identify, obviously, as well as knowing what they do and such things. Which, in case you haven't realized it yet, much of the head and neck involves cranial nerves. Knowing each cranial nerve, where it comes from, what kind of fibers it carries, what it does, whether they're carrying somatic motor or visceral sensory, somatic sensory, special sensory. We spent a lot of time on cranial nerves, and they're obviously a big part of the last two parts of the course. So you should really know these guys down cold, be able to identify them, and be able to answer lots of questions about them. And you've had a number of lectures that trace them out from their origin on the brain through various holes here and there to where they end up and what they do. So I can guarantee you will have to trace some pathways of cranial nerves. Some of them may be motor nerves, some of them may be sensory nerves, they carry sensory stuff, but know how they get from wherever they originate on the brain to wherever they end up, and what holes they go through, how they divvy themselves up, and in some crazy cases, how they hitchhike on another nerve. Again, sympathetic is supposed to be energy expenditure, parasympathetic energy intake, and that sort of makes sense in the thorax and abdomen, less so in the head. Sympathetics go to the body wall and the body cavity. Parasympathetics go to the body cavity and some stuff in the head, but not to the body wall. So you've got sympathetics going to sweat glands, and they can turn on, but they either turn on or they're not. They don't have a parasympathetic worry about that. But in the sympathetic system, generally in the parasympathetics, sympathetics, all their preganglionics come out of T1 through L2, and their ganglia are the paravertebral ganglia, going from C1 all the way down into the sacrum. Parasympathetics are different in the abdomen and thorax. The synapses are between the preganglionics and postganglionics are in the body wall. You don't see that happening, but in the head there are dissectable ganglia, and Dr. Fernandez talked about that, about where these ganglia are. Okay. And as I was saying, so these parasympathetics, they don't go to the organ to synapse, they synapse in ganglia, and then they have all sorts of bizarre pathways to end up where the organ that they're innervating. The parasympathetics can originate on only a few of the cranial nerves, but then they're likely to hitchhike and ride on a variety of other structures before they end up innervating whatever they're going to innervate. Okay, next. This is a little bit of what was supposed to be in the lecture, and I'm going to have to zip through this pretty quickly. Realize that there are a number of sort of components of the neck. So there's the skin and fascia out here, and then there's a cluster of the viscera of the neck, which includes the esophagus, the larynx, or the trachea, depending upon how far down you are. And then in the back, there's the area back here where you have the vertebrae and all the muscles that are attached to the vertebrae, phrenic nerve coming off of some of those, and the sympathetic trunks on the side of the cervical vertebrae. And then on either side, you have these carotid sheaths. Okay, with the vagus nerve, common carotid artery, and they can split up, can be the internal carotid artery and the internal jugular vein, depending on where you are. And then there's an area right here behind the pharynx. So the pharynx is part of this viscera. There's the retropharyngeal space. And we sort of saw these in bits and pieces, but we obviously didn't slice through the head to get this cross section. Okay, the posterior triangle sort of lies back in here on this side, and we dissected a lot of structures in there. So here's the visceral part, right, the dense investing layer. Here's an anterior area, right? These are where these strap muscles are. This is out here is where the posterior triangle are. This is all this vertebral area. These are the prevertebral fascias here, pretracheal fascia here, and then the carotid sheath and the alar fascia back here. I'll get to this again in a minute. This is the orientation of these structures again. Trachea, esophagus, internal jugular vein, vagus, and some part of the carotids, depending on where you cut, in this carotid sheath, and then all the vertebrae and their associated muscles in the back. Here are these muscles up in front. So this is part of the muscular triangle, part of the anterior triangle up here, all these strap muscles that we learned, coming from the sternum up to the hyoid and the thyroid, and there's your vertebral muscles. There are lots of triangles in the neck. There's the posterior triangle back here, an anterior triangle up front, but then that gets further subdivided into the muscular triangle where the strap muscles are, the carotid triangle that we've talked about a couple of times, a submental and a submandibular triangles, each of which have defined borders and contents. And there they are, just showing the triangles relative to specific muscles. Cross section of the neck, more of the same. Posterior triangle. Cervical plexus, which we dissected and had a number of distinctive features, particularly this ensa cervicalis, with the superior part coming off of the tied to the hypoglossal and dropping down, and then a posterior part coming back there, plus a variety of other nerves. More triangles, more muscles, more muscles, more muscles. External carotid. Need to know the branches of the external carotid artery. That was on your last exam, and may well be on this exam too. This is sort of basic stuff when you're working on his. And likewise the veins. And the root of the neck. We did a lot of structures in the root of the neck. It had vertebral arteries coming up, and then your thyrocervical trunk over here with branches going to the thyroid and to the back of the neck or going into the shoulder. A phrenic nerve lying here on the anterior scalene, and relationships between the scalene muscles and the brachial plexus going out on the side. As I said, lymphatic drainage from Dr. Wilberg's lecture. The lower part of the body, all the way up, and the left-hand side of the face and the left arm, all drain into the thoracic duct. Over here on the left-hand side, where the subclavian vein joins the internal jugular. The right side of the chest, the right arm, and the right side of the head, in gory detail we went over, drain into the right lymphatic duct over here. Spent a lot of time on facial muscles. You should know the main ones that we dissected. And there's sensory to the face, is branches of the trigeminal, with the B1 being the upper part running down the nose, B2 running here, and B3 the Abraham Lincoln beard. Cervical dorsal rami do the backside, and the cervical plexus goes to the neck. Innervation of these facial muscles, motor innervation of these facial muscles, comes from the facial nerve, right? Which comes, you saw it coming out of the ear, going into the ear. Someone saw it coming out of the ear, goes into the parotid gland, and then comes out and sends these branches to these facial muscles. Facial artery, facial vein, and their various parts. Scalp, layers, skin, connective tissue, aponeurosis, loose connective tissue, and pericranium needs to be